TPPA, hands off our environment. TPPA, workers' rights, not corporate rights. The negotiations are secret. There have been some briefings of community groups, but really we don't get to see the text or the detail of what's being negotiated. The only really detailed knowledge we have comes from leaks.
Under the ISDS provisions in it, if community protest ends up costing foreign companies money, then they would have the right to sue our government. There's an example in Canada at the moment with the US-based energy company who are using the ISDS provisions in the North America Trade Agreement to sue the Quebec state government for $250 million because that government said that there would be a moratorium on shale mining until a proper environmental study had been done. Just that study alone means that foreign company is suing the government. If Australia signs the TPPA, it'll be even greater reason for the government to ignore the voice of the community, and I can't emphasise what an impact that will have on our democratic right to protest and to campaign. And what is in it for Australia? No one's been able to say what's in this TPPA for Australia across any of these areas that the speakers here are talking about.
Only about 40% of people with HIV around the world get access to HIV medications. The cost of these has fallen to about $200 per year per person as the generics industry has got better at its job. The governments negotiating against the US position need to know that we will not accept winding back the clock on HIV medicines. The truth behind much drug development, that it is predominantly funded and developed by publicly funded research that we fund. It's only commercialised and marketed by the pharmaceutical industry. And many of these so-called new discoveries were actually of limited impact, and the patenting of them is simply a measure to extend the profit life of companies. We all know what this means in Australia as well, where medicines are subsidised, as I said earlier, through the PBS. At least part of the extra cost, perhaps all, would have to eventually be passed on to consumers. And even with a small increase in patient contribution for PBS medicines, many pensioners and disadvantaged Australians may find they need to postpone purchasing much needed medicines or simply go without. Our message to the Australian government today and to all of the signatories, the government signatories to the TPPA, is that they must hold the line. They must hold the line against the US negotiating position on intellectual property and allow no further extensions or broadening to the patent protections. The ultimate outcome for low-income Australians and for the hundreds and thousands of people in our region who struggle every day to pay medicines or die for lack of them may be to a large degree dependent on what direction Australia takes in these negotiations from this point on.
Australian stories are shown on Australian television, not because they rate well, although they do, not because they're great and they win awards, which they do. They're shown on Australian television because we have legislation which says they have to be shown. That's the only reason they're on. They're too expensive to make for the commercial networks or ABC and SBS to put them on of their own free will. The Australian people through their government have said, we want to tell our own stories, therefore, whatever it costs, we're going to put these shows on television. The previous government signalled that they supported a cultural carve-out in the TPPA. And the Media, Entertainment and Arts Alliance, the union representing people who work in the cultural industry, is calling on the new government to do the same and protect and preserve our national identity, but also the national identity of the 10 other countries negotiating.
This will consign us to an entertainment backwater where content will be both more expensive and released behind other audiences. What the WikiLeaks publication of the IP chapter demonstrates is that the Australian negotiators cannot be trusted to act in our interests. What the extreme bullying by US negotiators demonstrates is that the entire agreement is for the interests of US-based multinationals. We demand a seat at the table for civil society, not just of Australia, but of all countries. and not just from multinationals. Government is meant to act in the interest of its citizens, not foreign powers and their corporate backers. When this does not happen, it is up to us to stand up to the government for our own rights and the rights of all people.
Well, one of our first concerns is about what free trade agreements like the TPPA negotiations do to job security for Australian workers.
Foreign corporations are going to be invested with powers that supersede the rights of workers in their own country, and that supersede the powers of a parliament. On a moral basis, the investor-state dispute procedure directly undermines Australian sovereignty. It directly undermines the character of the parliament we understand. The right argument is on our side. We need to go out there and campaign vigorously and start conversations all over the place, because this is the heart of what is wrong with neoliberalism, with what is wrong with free market capitalism in Australia right now and in many other parts of the world.
But it has to be in the national interest. And how do you get a fair trade agreement? That's the big question. And there's been arguments recently that you can't have free trade and fair trade. But if you have core labour standards for workers between us and countries where we negotiate an agreement, if you have environmental checks and balances, if you have situations where a big corporation cannot dictate to us what's in our interest, then you get a good start to a fair trade agreement.
Now we know we have a tough campaign ahead of us. Obviously made much harder when it's highly secretive in this form, so how do you inform people of the extent of it? But with the leaks and with the past experience with these types of agreements, we know we have an important job, because so much of Australians' daily lives would be impacted. We see that the role of government should be standing up for the rights of Australians in terms of health, welfare, all those basic rights that many of us take for granted, that we know now that we certainly cannot take for granted if this agreement goes forward.
If you want to keep more in touch with the campaign, go to our website, aftinet.org.au. You can send a message directly to the Trade Minister by just pressing a button there. TPPA, workers' rights, not corporate rights. TPPA.